Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Family members of 12 politicians killed in 2002 by the rebel group known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, arrived in the capital of Bogota on Monday. They completed a 279-mile walk from the southwestern city of Cali in the name of peace and reparations for the victims of the country's 52-year-old civil war. Here's what a father of one of the victims had to say about the march.
Hopefully we can achieve the huge result of saying yes to peace, yes to the talks, and welcome the groups which has been the most stubborn group in Colombia so that they can enter civil society as a normal political group.
The march is one of many expressions of support that have been taking place in Colombia for the peace agreement between FARC and the Colombian government ever since the agreement was narrowly rejected in a referendum last October 2nd. Then, on October 7th, Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in this process. Government and FARC representatives are now back at the negotiating table in Havana, trying to rescue the agreement. On Monday, the leader of FARC, who is known as Timoshenko, sent out an optimistic tweet saying, "Close to defining an agreement that addresses the concerns of common people." Here he's referring to the abstainers, those who voted no, and those who voted yes. Joining us now from Quito, Ecuador, to take a closer look at the situation in Colombia's peace agreement is Gregory Wilpert. Gregory is a producer here at the Real News Network and has an article coming out on this topic in the next issue of Le Monde Diplomatique. Greg, good to have you with us.
My pleasure.
So, Greg, government and FARC negotiators are back at the table in Havana trying to find ways to change the agreement so that it is acceptable to all Colombians. Give us a brief rundown on the status of these talks.
Yes, so far they've only been talking for a couple days. And as you said, the leader of the FARC just issued the statement saying that he was basically an optimistic statement that they're making progress. And actually the government also sent out a similar tweet saying something very similar, that things were moving forward. Unfortunately, since it's behind closed doors, we don't have any details yet about what exactly is going on. But the important detail, I guess, is first of all that the ceasefire that the government and the FARC had agreed to originally in order to come to an agreement has been extended until December 31st. So that means essentially that the government is giving the FARC and itself until that date, until December 31st, in order to find a new agreement to perhaps put to a new vote. And so that's a little over 2 months now for them to reach an agreement. The main issues based on what the No campaign has said, and those are really the issues that need to be discussed, are fall into several different categories. One, a very important one, has to do with this whole concept of transitional justice. In other words, how the fighters of the FARC will be relieved from punishment if they lay down their arms and confess to their crimes. Then the other major issue is the issue of land restitution, returning land to displaced peasants. Another one has to do with political participation, that is the extent to which FARC members can participate in the political system. And then finally, the issue of how drug trafficking offenses should be dealt with. So those are basically the issues that the former president Alvaro Uribe outlined, and he was the main representative, in effect, for the No campaign.
And why is that? And what is he demanding in this process? Or this is something he could have actually achieved under his presidency, but didn't?
Yes, I mean, one of the things is that he had launched a peace process during his presidency that didn't go anywhere. And you could say that one of the main reasons why it didn't go anywhere was that he wasn't really that interested in the peace process, that he set the conditions for participating and finding an agreement far too high for the FARC. And he also relentlessly went after them and really actually contributed to a large part of the decimation of their numbers during his presidency. But he wasn't able to defeat them, which is one of the reasons, of course, that then Uribe's former Minister of Defense, when he became president, which is Juan Manuel Santos, when he became president, he was first of all, he was much more in favor of a peace agreement, mainly because he saw the civil war in Colombia as being an obstacle to economic growth, and to basically to implement a export-oriented economy, a neoliberal export-oriented economy in Colombia, and so he was very much in favor of and lowered the barrier really for the negotiations. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that Uribe himself comes more from the landed elite, and that really makes a difference, whereas Santos, the current president, comes more from the more metropolitan or cosmopolitan upper class, and has less of an interest in this landed elite, and is more interested in this in developing this neoliberal export model for Colombia. And whereas Uribe is much more interested in maintaining the land holdings of those people that he is really representing. So land restitution is really going to be one of the main issues in these new negotiations. The other factor and the other reason why why Uribe says he's against this, the agreement as it's currently written, is that he says that that this wasn't a civil war, but was a fight against narco-terrorism, and therefore terrorists should not receive any kind of amnesty, shouldn't receive any kind of concessions in the transitional justice program. And there he's taking actually a position that's kind of similar to that of Human Rights Watch, which has also taken a similar position that the crimes of the FARC should not be forgiven in any way. And that, of course, is something that the FARC, of course, it would provide them with no incentive really to demobilize. And so that's really going to be one of the main sticking points.
Now, Greg, 63% of the electorate abstained in this referendum. Why?
Yes, that's an enormous number. If you consider especially that only 18%, that is about a quarter of the number that abstained, actually voted against the agreement. So, that's a tremendous number. The thing is, in Colombia, historically speaking, abstention or non-participation in electoral processes actually has always been high. Colombia has one of the lowest participation rates, even for presidential elections. It rarely reaches even 50%. And so this is part of that overall pattern. But this referendum, you could argue, is even more important than a presidential election, because it would have determined the future of Colombia for the next generation or so. But still, so few people participated. And one of the main explanations for that really is that Colombia is a very highly depoliticized society, and the reason for that is that that political repression over the last 50 or so years has scared people out of the political process. I mean, if you think about it, constantly activists, particularly leftists, whether the union activists or ecological activists or whatever, they are being killed, assassinated. Just last month, another 2 people were assassinated. And so that creates an enormous barrier towards participation. And not only that, the very fact of the war made it very easy for conservatives and for the right wing to point at progressives and to say, hey, you guys are allied with the FARC. And as soon as, even if they weren't, which in most cases they aren't, that would scare them essentially into submission or into non-participation, because if you were labeled as somehow being a FARC sympathizer or one of the other rebel groups, well then you could be marked for death. And so that created an atmosphere of very low participation. And added onto that, of course, comes also the role of the media in Colombia, which is very conservative, very monolithic, and hardly allows for much diversity of thought or opinion. And so those two factors, that is the political repression and the monolithic right-wing media landscape, provide for a situation where people just feel like, participating in politics just makes no sense, and therefore they didn't do so in this referendum.
And also one curious thing about the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Santos and not to Timoshenko, who is the leader of the FARC. Obviously, for a peace process to succeed, both sides need to be encouraged in terms of the process and negotiations underway. Why do you think that happened?
Well, we don't really know for sure, but one of the main speculation about that is really that the FARC was labeled as a terrorist organization by both the European Union and the US government, and therefore the Nobel Committee probably didn't want to give a Nobel Peace Prize to somebody who was labeled in this way by two major governmental institutions. And so, both Uribe, Uribe actually said that this is really, he's going to accept the prize in the name of the Colombian people and the name also of the FARC. He included them. And so that was a way of papering over of that omission.
And recently, the government of Ecuador just announced this week that negotiations between Colombia's second rebel group, known as ELN, and the government will begin soon in Quito, Ecuador. However, there are recent reports of fighting between the two sides. What are the prospects for these talks to move forward and succeed?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because the negotiations are supposed to start next week. They're supposed to inaugurate the negotiating table this week, and then next week start the formal negotiations. But there have been some fighting, and then not only that, the government has now said that one of the conditions for the ELN, and this was really a last-minute condition, everything had been set. They've been negotiating for a while for this roadmap for peace negotiations with the ELN. And in the last minute, the government says, no, before we start, you need to turn over one of your last kidnap victims that the ELN still has. And the ELN is saying that's basically a deal breaker. And the reason for that is kind of complicated, but it basically has to do with the fact that there is no ceasefire during the negotiations. This was the same thing during the negotiations with the FARC. There was no ceasefire. So in other words, they can be fighting even during the negotiations. And for the ELN, having this politician that they've kidnapped essentially is a part of that ongoing war. In other words, they're saying, okay, if you do a ceasefire, then we might consider turning him over. But as long as there's no ceasefire, why should we do anything different than what we've been doing so far? So that's the real danger, is that the government continues to insist on turning over this politician, whereas the ELN might not concede, in which this whole thing might fall apart. On the other hand, the pressure for finding an agreement is enormous right at the moment, both because of the FARC agreement and because of this referendum. So we'll see. The Ecuadorian government is presenting a relatively optimistic face that things will move forward on Thursday, but right now it's a little bit iffy.
All right, Greg, I thank you so much for your update on this, and we'll keep an eye on it for the audience. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.